For my sister's birthday, they rented a yacht, hired a band, and surprised her with a weekend getaway. For mine, a store-bought cookie and a card signed from all of us. When I didn't smile, my mom said, "What did you expect? You're not a kid anymore." I just blew out the candle, packed a bag, and left without saying a word. That night, my cousin texted, "Dad's crying. Where are you?" I, 26M, stared at the single cookie on the paper plate, a generic chocolate chip thing still in its plastic wrapper. The candle was crooked, probably pulled from last year's leftover party supplies. My family sat around the dining table, watching me with expectant faces like this pathetic display was supposed to make me grateful. 3 months ago, they'd rented a yacht for my sister's 23rd birthday. I'd watched from the dock as the boat pulled away, filled with her friends, a live band, and enough champagne to float a smaller vessel. She'd gotten a weekend in the Bahamas, a designer handbag, and enough Instagram content to last the rest of the year. Now here I was on my 26th, looking at a cookie that probably cost them $3. My mother cleared her throat and gestured toward the sad excuse for a celebration. She told me to make a wish and blow out the candle. Her tone was the same one she used when asking me to take out the trash. I asked what happened to the usual birthday dinner, the cake, the effort they put into literally everyone else's special day. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair while my sister examined her nails with sudden intense interest. That's when my mother said it. She told me I wasn't a kid anymore, asked what I'd expected. The words hit like a physical blow. 26 apparently meant I'd aged out of basic human consideration. I looked around the table at these people who were supposed to love me. My younger sister got yachts and weekend getaways. My older brother had gotten a surprise party with 50 people just last year. But me? I got a convenience store cookie and the family's collective indifference. I blew out the candle without making a wish. What was the point? Then I stood up, told them thanks for the memorable evening, and walked upstairs to pack. My mother called after me, asking where I was going, but I didn't answer. I threw clothes into a duffel bag, grabbed my laptop and phone charger, and headed for the door. My father intercepted me in the hallway, wanting to know if I was being dramatic. I told him I was being realistic. 20 minutes later, I was in my car with no destination in mind. I drove until I found a motel on the outskirts of town, paid cash for a week, and turned off my phone. The room was basic but clean, with thin walls and a view of the parking lot. It was perfect. No one knew where I was. No one could make me feel invisible, and for the first time in years, the silence felt peaceful instead of lonely. I spent the next day walking around the unfamiliar area, eating at diners where no one knew my name or my family's twisted priorities. Every time I thought about that cookie, about my mother's dismissive tone, the anger burned fresh. That evening, I finally turned my phone back on. 17 missed calls and 43 text messages flooded the screen. Most were from my mother, demanding to know where I was and insisting I was overreacting. My father had sent 3 messages asking me to call him. My brother had texted once. Mom's freaking out. But the message that made me pause came from my cousin Jake. His dad was crying and asking where I was. My uncle, my father's brother, was apparently devastated that I'd disappeared. I called Jake back immediately. He answered on the first ring, sounding relieved to hear my voice. He told me his father had been at our house earlier, had seen the aftermath of my party, and was furious with my parents. Uncle Mike had apparently torn into them about how they'd treated me, called it disgraceful, and stormed out when my mother tried to defend herself. Jake said his dad had been calling my parents all evening, demanding they figure out where I was and make things right. My uncle was the only one in the family who'd ever treated me like I mattered, and hearing that he was upset on my behalf meant everything. I told Jake I was safe but needed space. He understood, said he'd let his father know, and promised to keep my location quiet. Before hanging up, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. My parents were planning to file a missing person report in the morning. That crossed a line. Using law enforcement to force me back into their toxic dynamic was manipulation at its finest. I spent the rest of the night planning my next move. The next morning, I called my parents before they could involve the police. My mother answered, immediately launching into a lecture about how worried sick they'd all been. I cut her off and told her I was an adult who'd left voluntarily, that filing a false police report would be illegal, and that if she wanted to see me again, she needed to listen. The line went quiet. Then my father took the phone, His voice strained as he asked what I wanted. I told him I wanted honesty about why they treated me like an afterthought, why my sister got yachts while I got convenience store cookies, and why they seemed surprised that I had feelings about it. He stammered something about not realizing I felt that way, about it not being intentional. I asked him when he'd last put real effort into my birthday, into any occasion that was supposed to celebrate me. The silence stretched long enough that I had my answer. My mother took the phone back and tried a different approach. She said they loved me equally, that money was tight, that I was old enough to understand. I reminded her that money hadn't been tight 3 months ago when they'd rented a yacht, and asked why my sister's age hadn't disqualified her from elaborate celebrations. More silence. I told them I needed space to think, that I'd be staying away for a while, and that any attempts to force me home would only make things worse. My father tried to argue, but I hung up. Update 1. 3 days into my motel stay, my brother showed up. I was coming back from dinner when I saw him leaning against my car in the parking lot. He looked uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere else. He asked if we could talk, and I nodded toward the motel room. Once inside, he sat on the single chair while I remained standing, arms crossed. He told me our parents had sent him to convince me to come home, that mom was having panic attacks, and dad wasn't sleeping. I asked if either of them had considered that their actions might have consequences. My brother shifted uncomfortably, then admitted something that surprised me. He said he'd always known they treated me differently, that it had bothered him, but he'd never known how to address it. He'd convinced himself it wasn't his problem to solve. I asked why my sister got yachts and weekend getaways while I got cookies and criticism. He was quiet for a long moment, then said something that made everything click into place. Our parents had always seen my sister as fragile, someone who needed extra support and encouragement. They saw me as capable, independent, someone who didn't need their validation. The irony was crushing. They'd neglected me because they thought I was strong enough to handle it. My brother said he'd talked to our parents about the birthday disaster, told them they'd screwed up badly. Mom had cried, Dad had gotten defensive, and my sister had finally admitted she felt guilty about the different treatment but had been too uncomfortable to say anything. I asked if any of them had considered apologizing or acknowledging the years of making me feel invisible. He said they wanted to, but didn't know how. I told him it was simple. They could start by admitting they'd been wrong, stop making excuses, and demonstrate through actions that I actually mattered to them. Words were cheap after 26 years of evidence to the contrary. He nodded, said he'd relay the message, and asked when I might come home. I told him I wasn't sure I would. The relief of being away from their dysfunction was intoxicating. After he left, I sat in that little motel room and realized something important. I didn't need their validation anymore. The desperate, hurt kid who'd blown out that pathetic candle was evolving into someone who refused to accept crumbs. Update 2. A week later, Uncle Mike showed up at the motel. Jake had given him my location, but only after I'd agreed to the visit. My uncle was the one person in the family whose opinion I truly respected. He knocked on my door at sunset, carrying a grocery bag and wearing the kind of expression that meant business. I let him in, and he immediately started unpacking the bag. Real food, decent coffee, and a homemade chocolate cake with "Happy Belated Birthday" written in blue frosting. He set up the impromptu celebration on the small table, lit a proper candle, and told me to make a wish. For the first time in weeks, I smiled genuinely. After I'd blown out the candle, he sat across from me and asked how I was holding up. I told him about the relief of being away, about finally understanding that I'd been accepting unacceptable treatment for years. Uncle Mike nodded grimly and said he'd had a long conversation with my father about the family dynamics. Apparently, my dad had broken down and admitted they'd taken me for granted, assumed I didn't need the same level of attention as my siblings. My uncle had pointed out how destructive that assumption was, how it had essentially punished me for being low maintenance. He'd told my parents that strength shouldn't be rewarded with neglect, and that they'd created a situation where I felt invisible in my own family. He said my mother had been defensive at first, insisting they loved all their children equally. But when he'd asked her to list the last 5 significant things they'd done to celebrate me specifically, she'd gone quiet. My uncle leaned back in his chair and asked what I wanted from the situation. I told him I wasn't sure forgiveness was possible, that too much damage had been done over too many years. He understood, but suggested I consider what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted moving forward. Complete estrangement was an option, but it would affect more than just my immediate family. That night, I thought about his words while eating real cake and drinking decent coffee. The truth was, I wasn't ready to forgive, but I was starting to formulate a different plan. Update 3. 2 weeks after leaving, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going home, but I wasn't disappearing forever either. Instead, I was going to take control of the narrative. I called my parents and told them I'd come to Sunday dinner that weekend, but with conditions. I'd arrive at exactly 6 p.m., say what I needed to say, and leave by 7 p.m. No arguments, no drama, no attempts to guilt me into staying longer. That Sunday, I walked into the house I'd grown up in feeling like a different person. The family was already gathered in the living room, looking nervous and uncertain. I sat in the chair I'd occupied for 26 years and looked at each of them in turn. Then I began talking. I told them about the years of feeling invisible, of watching my siblings get elaborate celebrations while receiving afterthoughts. I described the humiliation of that cookie, the casual dismissal of my feelings, and the relief I'd felt walking away from all of it. My mother tried to interrupt, to offer explanations and excuses, but I held up my hand and continued. I said I understood they'd seen me as the capable one, the one who didn't need extra attention. But I explained how that perception had become a prison, how it had taught me that my needs didn't matter as much as everyone else's. My father was crying openly now, and my sister looked stricken. My brother sat with his head in his hands. I told them I wasn't there for apologies or promises to do better. I was there to announce my new boundaries. I would no longer attend family gatherings where I felt like an afterthought. I wouldn't participate in birthdays, holidays, or celebrations unless they demonstrated genuine effort and consideration. Most importantly, I was moving out of state. I'd been offered a job in another city, and I was taking it. The physical distance would help me build a life where I wasn't constantly reminded of my place in the family hierarchy. My mother finally broke down, sobbing that she'd never meant to make me feel unloved. My father asked if there was anything they could do to fix things. I stood up and told them that some damage couldn't be undone, but they could work on not repeating the patterns with future relationships. I suggested they examine how they treated people they claimed to love and whether their actions matched their words. As I walked toward the door, my sister finally spoke up. She said she was sorry, that she'd known the treatment was unfair, but had been too selfish to risk losing her privileged position by speaking up. I nodded, told her I appreciated the honesty, and left. Final update. 6 months later, I'm settled in my new city with a job I love and friends who actually see me. The distance has given me clarity about my family that proximity never could. My parents have made some efforts to rebuild our relationship. They call regularly, send care packages, and have even visited twice. The conversations are still awkward, but there's genuine remorse in their actions now. My sister has been the biggest surprise. She's reached out consistently, actually putting effort into maintaining contact. She's even started calling out favoritism when she sees it in other families, like she's trying to atone for benefiting from it for so long. My brother remains largely unchanged, but that's fine. Not everyone needs to be close. Uncle Mike visits every few months, and those dinners are some of the best parts of my new life. He's proud of how I handled the situation, says it took courage to walk away from dysfunction even when it was comfortable. The most important thing I've learned is that family love isn't automatic or unconditional. It requires effort, consideration, and genuine care. When those elements are missing, blood relation becomes meaningless. I don't regret leaving that night. That convenience store cookie was the last straw, but it was also the beginning of my real life. Sometimes you have to lose a family to find yourself. My birthday this year was celebrated with friends who planned ahead, put thought into the celebration, and made me feel valued. It wasn't a yacht, but it was sincere, and that made all the difference. The angry, invisible kid who blew out that crooked candle 6 months ago would barely recognize the person I've become. I'm still learning to prioritize my own needs, but I'm getting better at it every day. As for forgiveness, I'm not there yet. Maybe I never will be. But I've found something better than forgiveness. I've found peace. And sometimes that's enough.